guys! Welcome to our first lesson in topic 3, which is about biodiversity and conservation. In this lesson, we're just going to introduce some of the basic concepts of biodiversity that have to do with environmental systems and societies and how humans interact with the world around them. So let's get started. First, I want you to think about, in terms of biodiversity, what is the human relationship to other organisms, and how do we perceive or appreciate or treat biodiversity in our world? Is it a commodity? Is it a tourist attraction? Is it something that's integral to life in general? People have different views about this, and I think that's okay. But it says a lot about how people interact with the biodiversity around them, how they view it, what environmental value system they perceive it from. We also talk in this topic about the moral and ethical benefits and drawbacks of different ways of conserving biodiversity, specifically stuff like zoos and wildlife preserves, what it means that those exist, and how we view them. This picture is from SeaWorld. And in my ESS class, we watch a documentary movie called Blackfish that I would recommend if you have some time to kill and you're interested in documentary films. It should be available on streaming websites like Netflix, or you could also just pay to download it. I would pay to download it because it's a pretty good resource, and a lot of good resources went into the making of it. And it talks a lot about the journey of SeaWorld as it relates to keeping big mammals for human interaction and entertainment. So it's pretty one-sided, but it's an interesting perspective on what it means to keep large mammals pent up in zoos and contained spaces. So keep these questions in mind as we're going through this whole unit, because we'll keep coming back to this idea of what's our human relationship with biodiversity, what environmental value system do we come at biodiversity from, and what are the moral and ethical benefits and drawbacks of our environmental value systems. In terms of understanding biodiversity, it's important to consider where biodiversity is most present on our planet. And we talk about a concept known as a biodiversity hotspot, which is areas where there is a lot of biodiversity, a huge amount of biodiversity. They're in mostly rainforests, but they're present all over the world. And they're areas that we as a human population put special energy into trying to conserve because they're seen as areas of big environmental importance. If you have some time, you can watch this video. If it doesn't hyperlink on your screen, you can Google Animal Planet News, Biodiversity Hotspots, and it's on YouTube. And it's about how we view biodiversity in our world. But some important biodiversity hotspots are these 5: the Mediterranean Basin, the Amazon rainforest, Japan, Madagascar, and New Zealand. A lot of times in an ESS paper too, it will ask you to give a named example of a biodiversity hotspot. So those are good ones to keep in mind. Some people disagree with the creation of these hotspots in terms of evaluation points and drawbacks. People say that biodiversity hotspots are mostly decided based on the plant species that are present there, and they're not necessarily the best indication of what's actually happening with biodiversity in our planet. But in favor of biodiversity hotspots, they are a useful measure of habitat destruction. Since biodiversity is carefully measured in these places, we can have some way of cataloging how fast species are going extinct. So that's important. The next thing that we'll talk about is when we say biodiversity, what do we mean? Because there are all different ways that you can classify biodiversity. And there's 3 main things that we look at in this course. We look at genetic diversity, which is the amount of variation in an individual species. Species diversity, which is the amount of different species present in an area. And habitat diversity, which is the range of different habitats per unit area in a given environment or ecosystem. So how easy is it for a large variety of things to live in a given place? This picture is a picture of an organism that is not very diverse. This is the gray seal, and they live entirely on the islands, the Farne Islands off the coast of England, which obviously limits the habitat diversity and the species diversity of those islands because there's only this one big kind of seal living there. And it also limits the genetic diversity of their population because they all live in relatively close proximity. And if something were to happen to these gray seals on one island, it would impact the overall population in a really significant way. We can look at all different kinds of ecosystems and talk about whether they're diverse or not. For example, in this petri dish, we do not see a lot of species diversity or a lot of genetic diversity. It's likely that this strain of bacteria is the only thing growing in there. If an abiotic condition like temperature were to be introduced that this species could not survive, everything living in that petri dish would die off. That's in direct comparison to an environment like the rainforest, where you do have a huge amount of both species and habitat diversity. There are a lot of different things that live in the rainforest and a lot of different places they can live. And within those populations, since habitat diversity is so high, genetic diversity is likely to be high also. The other things that you can look at are examples like a school of fish or a school of children. Which one is more genetically diverse and how do we know? It's important when you view ecosystems around you to be considering their diversity. Are they genetically diverse? Are there a lot of species represented in a given area? Are there a lot of places where species could live in a given ecosystem? Those are all questions that tie in to diversity. The next thing that we're going to look at is biodiversity important and can it be misleading sometimes? So high biodiversity is important because it increases the resilience of an ecosystem. We talked about that concept of resilience back in chapter 1. And it's the idea that if you have a diverse ecosystem, that ecosystem is resistant to large changes. This feeds into negative feedback when there's increased resistance. Also, increased genetic resistance can give increased resistance to disease, which leads to species surviving for longer periods of time. But in terms of the drawbacks of using biodiversity as an indicator of overall ecosystem health, there are some stable ecosystems that just aren't very diverse, like tundras that we learned about in chapter 2. They just don't have very many plants. They're sort of in a static equilibrium. They're healthy, but they're not very diverse. You can also have false biodiversity values due to habitat fragmentation. So you can look at an area and maybe a bulldozer made a road through the middle of a rainforest. It seems like there's good diversity on both sides of that road, but in reality, the ecosystem would be much healthier if the whole ecosystem was still together. So in this basic information about biodiversity, you should feel comfortable answering a few kinds of questions. And let's take a look at your homework. If you're following along in the textbook, you can read section 3.1, which is pages 144 to 149. And we are going to do some paper 1 style questions, some case study questions about biodiversity. You have in your homework sheet some text information provided on the Guinean forests of West Africa that you can use to help you answer these 2 questions. Discuss the importance of naming and protecting biodiversity hotspots. So discuss is a new term for us. It means to present sort of a range of arguments and justify which is your opinion and why. And then also define the term endemic and state an example of an endemic species. We actually didn't define endemic in this PowerPoint, so let's go over that quickly, even though it is mentioned in your homework. Endemic means that a species is housed only in one specific ecosystem in the world. So if a species is endemic to an area, it means it only exists there. And your homework gives some examples of different endemic species in the Ghanaian forest in West Africa. You then need to evaluate the usefulness of providing specific numerical values for species diversity. So go over the reading that's provided, have a crack at those 2 questions, and when you are ready, you can review your responses in the review video. And I will see you there.